The scream tore through the cold Montana morning like a knife, shattering the stillness of the small town of Lavetta. Grace Patterson clutched the bloody sheets to her chest as the midwife's face told her everything she didn't want to know. Her baby had never drawn a single breath in this world. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson," the midwife said, her voice heavy with the weight of delivering such news countless times before. There was nothing to be done. Grace's world collapsed inward, the cabin walls seeming to close in as reality crashed down upon her. Her husband Thomas had been dead 3 months now, caught in a mining accident that had left her a widow at 24. The baby had been all she had left of him, the only future worth holding on to. "Where is she?" Grace whispered, her throat raw from hours of labor that had yielded only heartbreak. The midwife hesitated. "Perhaps it's best if I want to see my daughter." The bundle the midwife placed in her arms was impossibly small, perfectly formed but still. Grace traced the tiny features: a nose like Thomas's, delicate eyelids that would never open, small fingers that would never grasp hers in return. "I would have named you Elizabeth," Grace whispered. "After my mother." The midwife squeezed her shoulder. "I'll fetch Mrs. Holloway from next door to sit with you. You shouldn't be alone." But Grace barely heard her. She was already alone, more alone than she'd ever been. Outside, the spring of 1878 was just beginning to touch the Montana territory with its gentle promise. Inside the small cabin, winter still held Grace's heart in an iron grip. 3 days later, they buried the tiny pine box beneath an old oak tree on the hill overlooking town. Grace stood ramrod straight as the preacher spoke words that couldn't possibly capture the depth of her loss. The townsfolk of Lavetta had turned out in respectable numbers, not for her, she knew, but because death was something they all understood too well in this harsh land. "Mrs. Patterson," Mayor Wilkins approached after the service, hat in hand. "I know this isn't the time, but there's the matter of the cabin, with Thomas gone and the rent." Grace nodded numbly. Of course. The mining company owned the cabin. Without Thomas working their claim, she had no right to stay. "How long do I have?" "End of the month." He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm sorry." Grace turned away, her eyes fixed on the small mound of fresh earth. "End of the month. 2 weeks to figure out how to keep breathing in a world that had taken everything from her." She didn't notice the tall figure watching from the edge of the cemetery, his weathered hat pulled low against the sun. Nor did she see the way his eyes followed her as she made her solitary walk back to a home that would soon no longer be hers. Jacob Weston adjusted his hat and turned back toward the livery stable. He'd been passing through Lavetta on his way north, planning to stay just long enough to rest his horse and restock supplies. But something about the solitary woman standing unbending before the tiniest grave he'd ever seen made him pause. He'd seen plenty of grief in his 30 years, most of it during the war and the hard years that followed. He recognized the look of someone standing at the edge of an abyss, trying to decide whether to step back or forward. "Who was that?" Jacob asked the livery owner as he handed over coins for his horse's care. The older man glanced toward the cemetery. "Grace Patterson, widow. Just lost her baby too. Damn shame, husband was killed in the Silver Peak collapse a few months back." Jacob nodded, turning the information over in his mind. "She got family around here?" "Nope, came out from Boston with her husband about a year ago. Mining company's giving her till the end of the month to clear out of the company cabin." Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd seen it too often, the companies that lured men west with promises of fortune, then discarded their widows and orphans without a second thought when tragedy struck. "Need a hand with anything?" he asked, changing the subject. "I've got time to kill." The livery owner eyed him skeptically. "You don't strike me as a man with time to spare, mister," Jacob shrugged. "Plans change." The next morning, Grace stood in the center of her small cabin, trying to make sense of what remained of her life. Everything she and Thomas had brought from Boston could fit in a single trunk. Everything they'd acquired since the few pieces of furniture, the dishes, The quilt she'd been sewing for the baby would have to be sold or left behind. A knock at the door startled her. Few people had visited since the funeral. Most townsfolk uncomfortable with grief, they couldn't fix with a casserole or kind word. She opened the door to find a man she didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a face weathered by sun and wind. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples despite his relatively young age. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Jacob Weston," Grace frowned. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't. I was at the—" He hesitated. "The service yesterday. I'm sorry for your loss." Grace's hand tightened on the door frame. "Thank you, Mr. Weston. If you'll excuse me, I heard you might be looking for work. I'm heading a cattle drive up to Helena. Need someone who can cook for the crew." The words came out in a rush as if he hadn't planned to say them. Grace stared at him. "A cattle drive? I don't know the first thing about cattle. Don't need to. Just need to know how to make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in and biscuits that won't break teeth." He offered a slight smile. "Pays $15 a month plus room and board." "It's 3 months' work, give or take." Grace's mind raced. $15 a month was more than Thomas had made at the mine. Enough to get her started somewhere new, perhaps, but a cattle drive, with a crew of strange men, why me? She asked bluntly. "There must be others more qualified." Jacob shifted his weight. "Last cook broke his leg 2 days ago. We're moving out tomorrow, and honestly, madam, I thought you might be needing a fresh start." Grace studied him. He didn't have the look of a man who offered charity easily, yet there was something in his eyes, not pity, which she would have rejected outright, but a kind of understanding. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. He nodded. "We leave at first light." "I'll be at the livery if you decide to come." He settled his hat back on his head and turned to leave. "Mr. Weston," she called after him. "I don't ride." He glanced back. "Got a wagon for the supplies. You'd ride there." After he left, Grace stood in the doorway for a long time. The sensible answer was no. A woman alone with a crew of cowboys was asking for trouble. She knew nothing about cooking for a large group, and even less about the trail. But as she turned back to the empty cabin, her gaze fell on the small cradle in the corner, the one Thomas had built with such care and pride. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of grief through her, so powerful she had to grip the table to keep from falling. Grace made her decision before dawn. She packed her trunk with everything that mattered: Thomas's pocket watch, her mother's silver hairbrush, the small blanket she'd finished for the baby. The rest she left behind. Let the mining company deal with it. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when she reached the livery. Jacob was already there, giving instructions to a group of men who regarded her with open curiosity as she approached. "Mrs. Patterson," Jacob said, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he composed it. "Glad you decided to join us." "I have conditions," Grace said firmly, lifting her chin. "I'll work hard, but I expect to be treated with respect, and I'll need my privacy." Jacob nodded. "You'll have your own tent, and anyone who forgets their manners answers to me." He said it casually, but there was steel beneath the words. He introduced her to the crew, 6 men ranging from a grizzled old-timer called Doc, who'd apparently never been within 10 feet of a medical textbook, to a boy barely out of his teens who blushed crimson when she shook his hand. "Madam, I'm Liam," the young one stammered. "I'll help you with whatever you need." "Thank you, Liam," Grace said, finding a small smile despite herself. "Better get moving," Jacob announced. "Daylight's wasting." Grace's trunk was loaded into a sturdy wagon alongside sacks of flour, coffee, beans, and other provisions. Jacob helped her onto the wooden seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Last chance to change your mind," he said quietly. Grace looked back at Lavetta, at the small cemetery on the hill where her husband and daughter lay. There was nothing for her here but grief. "I'm ready," she said, facing forward. The first days on the trail were a blur for Grace. The physical demands of cooking for 8 hungry men over an open fire left her exhausted, her hands blistered and her back aching. But the work was a mercy, keeping her too busy to dwell on what she'd lost. The men were cautious around her at first, awkward in the presence of a woman, particularly one marked by recent tragedy. But as days passed, they relaxed, grateful for meals that were a vast improvement over what they'd been enduring. "These are the best biscuits I've had since my mama's," Doc declared on the third morning, reaching for his fourth. "Trail boss did good finding you, Mrs. Patterson." Jacob, who sat slightly apart from the others, nodded slightly at the compliment but said nothing. Grace had noticed he tended to keep his distance, giving orders when necessary, but otherwise maintaining a certain reserve with both her and the men. She learned the rhythm of trail life quickly up before dawn to get coffee brewing and breakfast started, packing the wagon while the men broke camp, traveling until midday before stopping for a cold lunch, then making camp by late afternoon to start the evening meal. On the sixth night, as she was scrubbing the last of the dinner dishes with sand and precious water, Jacob approached and handed her a cup of coffee. "You're doing well," he said. "Better than I expected." Grace accepted the coffee, warming her hands around the tin cup. "You mean for a city woman who's never cooked over an open fire before?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "I've known experienced trail cooks who couldn't manage half as well." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the crackling fire and distant lowing of cattle the only sounds. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Weston?" Grace ventured. "Jacob," he corrected. "Out here, last name seemed too formal." "Jacob then," she hesitated. "Why did you really hire me? And don't say it was because your cook broke his leg." He studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "That part was true enough, but I could have found someone else in town." "So why me?" Jacob set his cup down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I recognized something in you at the funeral, a kind of resilience. I've seen people broken by less than what you've endured." Grace looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "You were wrong then. I'm not resilient. I'm just surviving. That's all any of us are doing out here," he replied. "Some just do it with more grace than others." There was a hint of a smile when he said her name. "And what are you surviving, Jacob?" She asked softly. His expression shuddered. "It's late. You should get some rest." He walked away before she could press further, leaving Grace with the distinct impression she'd touched on something he preferred to keep buried. The next morning, as they crossed a shallow river, one of the wagon wheels struck a hidden rock and cracked. The wagon lurched sickeningly, and Grace had to grab the seat to avoid being thrown. Jacob was at her side instantly, strong hands steadying her. "Are you hurt?" "No, just startled," she assured him, acutely aware of how close he stood, the warmth of his hands through the fabric of her sleeve. They made camp early to repair the wheel. While the men worked, Grace took the opportunity to wash clothes in the river, grateful for a chance to feel clean after days of dust and sweat. She was hanging her things to dry when she noticed a small cluster of wildflowers growing nearby. Without thinking, she picked a few, bringing them to her nose to breathe in their sweet scent. The simple beauty of them made her throat tighten unexpectedly. Elizabeth would never see wildflowers, never smell them, never hold them in tiny hands. The grief that Grace had been holding at bay through sheer determination and exhaustion crashed over her. She sank to her knees, clutching the flowers, as sobs tore from her chest. She wasn't sure how long she knelt there, but eventually she became aware of someone nearby. She looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see Jacob standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression of quiet understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. "I'll be fine in a moment." Instead of retreating, Jacob came closer, lowering himself to sit beside her on the riverbank. He didn't speak, didn't try to offer empty comfort or tell her it would get better with time. He simply remained, a solid presence as she wept for the child she would never hold. When her tears finally subsided, he offered a clean bandana. Grace wiped her face, then stared out at the river. "Her name was going to be Elizabeth," she said, her voice hoarse. "She never even took a breath." Jacob nodded. "My sister lost 2 babies that way. Said the hardest part was not having a chance to know them." "Yes," Grace agreed, surprised by his understanding. It's like mourning a dream, all the things I imagined for her. First steps, first words, watching her grow, gone before they could begin. Tell me about her, Jacob said quietly. So Grace did. She told him about the nursery rhymes she'd planned to sing, the stories she would have read, the dress she'd been sewing from one of her old skirts. She spoke of Thomas's excitement, how he'd painted a small wooden horse as the baby's first toy. Jacob listened, really listened, in a way few people had since the tragedy. He didn't try to find the silver lining or suggest she could have another child someday. He simply bore witness to her loss. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the river, Grace realized she felt different, not healed, not even close, but somehow lighter for having shared her grief. "Thank you," she said simply. Jacob nodded, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "We should get back before they send a search party." Grace took his hand, allowing him to pull her up. For a moment they stood close, her hand still in his, and something shifted in the air between them. Then Jacob stepped back, clearing his throat. "Wheels fixed. We'll move out at first light." As the cattle drive continued north, the landscape changed, prairie giving way to rolling hills and eventually the distant outline of mountains. The days grew warmer, and Grace found herself settling into the rhythm of trail life with unexpected ease. She also found herself watching Jacob more than she should. There was something compelling about the quiet authority he carried, the way the men respected him without fear. He worked alongside them during the day, taking his turn at the difficult tasks, yet maintained the slight distance his position required. 2 weeks into the journey, a spring storm blew in without warning, turning the trail to mud and sending the cattle into a nervous frenzy. The men worked frantically to keep the herd together as thunder crashed overhead and rain poured down in sheets. Grace struggled to keep the wagon on the increasingly treacherous path, the horses skittish with each lightning flash. Suddenly, a particularly loud thunderclap sent them bolting forward. The wagon lurched violently as one wheel slipped into a hidden washout. Grace was thrown from the seat, landing hard in the mud. For a moment, she lay stunned, the rain pelting her face as she tried to catch her breath. Then strong arms were lifting her and Jacob's concerned face appeared above her. "Are you hurt?" he shouted over the storm. Grace did a mental assessment. Everything hurt, but nothing seemed broken. "I'm all right," she called back. Jacob didn't look convinced. He helped her to her feet, then kept his arm around her waist as he led her toward a stand of trees where the men had managed to corral most of the herd. "We'll wait out the worst of it here," he said, guiding her beneath the partial shelter of a large oak. "Liam's got the horses." Grace nodded, shivering as the adrenaline wore off and the cold rain penetrated her clothes. Jacob shed his oilskin coat and wrapped it around her shoulders despite her protests. "You'll catch your death," she objected. "I've weathered worse," he replied, his shirt already soaked through and clinging to the broad planes of his chest. They stood close together under the tree, watching the storm rage around them. Grace was acutely aware of Jacob beside her, of the heat radiating from his body despite his wet clothes. "I'm sorry about the wagon," she said, raising her voice over a rumble of thunder. "Wagon's fine. I was worried about you." The simple admission sent an unexpected warmth through her. "I'm tougher than I look," she said, echoing words Thomas had often teased her with during their early days in Montana. Jacob's eyes, gray as the storm clouds, met hers. "I never doubted it." Something in his gaze made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might touch her, perhaps brush back the wet strand of hair plastered to her cheek. Instead, he looked away, scanning the horizon. Storms moving east. We should be able to get moving again soon. The moment, whatever it had been, passed. Grace told herself it was for the best. She was a widow, still raw with grief. Jacob was her employer, and in less than 2 months they would reach Helena and go their separate ways. Yet that night, huddled in her tent as rain continued to patter gently on the canvas, Grace found herself thinking not of Thomas, but of Jacob's steady presence in the storm and the look in his eyes when he'd said he was worried about her. As May turned to June, the weather improved and the pace of the drive increased. They were making good time. Jacob announced one evening and should reach Helena ahead of schedule if their luck held. The news should have pleased Grace. Instead, it filled her with an odd sense of dread. She had no plans beyond the cattle drive, no destination in mind once they reached Helena. All she had was the small amount of money she'd managed to save from Thomas's final pay and what she would earn from the drive. She was lost in these thoughts, absently stirring a pot of beans when Jacob approached the cook fire. "Everything all right?" he asked. "You've been quiet today." Grace glanced up, surprised by his observation. "Just thinking about what comes after Helena," she admitted. Jacob nodded, settling onto a log nearby. "Any ideas?" "Not really. Fine work, I suppose. A boarding house, maybe." She tried to sound more confident than she felt. "Helena's growing fast. Lots of opportunities there." He hesitated. "I know people if you need introductions." The offer touched her. "Thank you, I might take you up on that." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Jacob spoke again. "You could also continue north with me if you wanted." Grace's head snapped up. "North? After we deliver the herd, I'm heading to my ranch near Great Falls." "It's good country, growing fast but not as crowded as Helena." Her heart beat faster. "And what would I do there?" Jacob met her gaze steadily. "Whatever you want. There's a small town nearby that could use a good seamstress from what I've seen of your needlework." Or, he trailed off. "Or." She prompted. He looked uncomfortable. "Or you could stay at the ranch. I could use someone to keep things in order at the house. It's not much, but it's comfortable enough." Grace studied him, trying to understand what he was really offering, a job or something more. "I'll think about it," she said finally, unsure of her own feelings, let alone his. Jacob nodded and stood. "No rush to decide. We're still a few weeks out from Helena." As he walked away, Grace watched him, wondering at the flutter of anticipation his offer had stirred. It was too soon, she told herself firmly. Too soon after Thomas, too soon after the baby. Yet the thought of continuing north with Jacob was undeniably appealing. The next day, as they made their way through a narrow valley, Jacob rode back from his position at the front of the herd with a frown creasing his brow. "Change of plans," he announced to the men gathered for the midday break. "We're going to divert west for a few miles. There's trouble ahead." "What kind of trouble?" Doc asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Rustlers hit a drive about a day ahead of us, killed 2 men and took half the herd." Jacob's expression was grim. "Army patrol warned me." A murmur went through the group. Cattle rustling was common enough, but murder made it a different matter entirely. "We're adding night watches," Jacob continued. 2 men at a time, rotating shifts. The men nodded, their faces serious. Even young Liam looked solemn as he checked his rifle. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pleasant June weather. She'd been lulled into a false sense of security by the routine of the trail, forgetting the very real dangers that existed out here. That night, after the camp had settled, Grace found herself unable to sleep. Every sound made her start: the rustle of wind through grass, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft footsteps of the men on watch. Finally, she gave up and emerged from her tent, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the night chill. The camp was quiet, most of the men asleep except for the 2 figures she could just make out circling the herd. She made her way to the dying embers of the cook fire, intending to stoke it back to life and make some tea. As she knelt by the fire, a voice spoke from the darkness. "Couldn't sleep." Grace gasped, nearly toppling backward before recognizing Jacob's voice. He emerged from the shadows, his features barely visible in the faint light of the banked fire. "You startled me," she admonished, a hand pressed to her racing heart. "Sorry." He moved closer, adding a small log to the embers. "Thought you might be cold." "Thank you." She watched as he expertly rebuilt the fire, coaxing the flames back to life with practiced movements. "Why are you awake? I thought Doc and Liam had first watch." "They do, He shrugged. "I like to check things myself sometimes." Grace understood. It was his herd, his responsibility. The lives of everyone in the camp rested on his decisions. "Are you worried about the rustlers?" she asked directly. Jacob considered her question before answering. "Worried enough to be careful. Not worried enough to panic." "That's not very reassuring," Grace said dryly. He smiled slightly. "Would you prefer I lie?" "No, I've had enough lies dressed up as comfort to last a lifetime." Too many people had told her Thomas was in a better place or that losing the baby was God's will. As if those platitudes could fill the emptiness inside her. "Then I'll tell you the truth. There's always danger on the trail, whether accidents, sickness, bad men. All we can do is be prepared and keep moving forward." Grace nodded, finding his honesty strangely comforting. "Is that your philosophy for life as well? Keep moving forward? Has to be out here." Jacob stared into the flames. "Stop moving and this country will swallow you whole." The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong lines of his jaw and brow. Grace wondered, not for the first time, what had shaped him, what joys and sorrows had carved those lines, what experiences had put the shadows in his eyes. "You never talk about yourself," she observed. "The men speak of their families, their pasts, but you never do." Jacob's expression remained neutral. "Not much to tell." "I don't believe that," Grace said softly. "Everyone has a story." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, just as she was about to give up, he spoke. "I was married once, a long time ago." Grace waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say but wouldn't without encouragement. "What happened?" she asked gently. Jacob's eyes remained fixed on the fire. "War happened. I went east to fight. Emily stayed in Kansas with her family." His voice was flat, as if recounting someone else's history. "When I came back in '65, there was nothing left. Raiders had burned the town. She died in the fire along with her parents." "Oh, Jacob," Grace reached out instinctively, placing her hand on his arm. "I'm so sorry." He nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without looking at her. "After that, I kept moving. Worked cattle drives, tried mining for a while, did some scouting for the army, finally saved enough for my own place about 5 years ago." "And now you have your ranch," Grace said, trying to imagine the home he'd built for himself. "It's not much. A house, a barn, good water, and grazing land." A hint of pride crept into his voice. 200 head of my own, not counting this herd we're taking to market." "It sounds wonderful," Grace said sincerely. Jacob finally looked at her, something unreadable in his expression. "It's lonely," he admitted, the words seeming to surprise even him. "A man alone on a ranch that size, it's not what I pictured when I started building it." The vulnerability in his confession touched her deeply. Before she could respond, a shout came from the direction of the herd. Jacob was on his feet instantly, hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Get in your tent," he ordered, all trace of the momentary openness gone. "Stay there until I come for you." Grace hurried to obey as Jacob strode toward the commotion. From the relative safety of her tent, she strained to hear what was happening. There were voices, but no shots fired. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only minutes, the voices died down. She jumped when the tent flap moved, relaxing only when Jacob's familiar silhouette appeared. "It's all right," he said. "False alarm, one of the steers wandered off and spooked Liam." Relief washed over her. "Thank goodness." Jacob hesitated at the entrance. "You should try to sleep." "Long day tomorrow." "Jacob," Grace called softly as he turned to leave. "Thank you for telling me about Emily." He paused. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it hurt any less," she said, knowing all too well how grief could lie dormant for years only to resurface without warning. Jacob nodded once. "Good night, Grace." "Good night," she replied, watching his shadow retreat across the camp. She lay awake for a long time afterward, thinking about Jacob's revelation. He understood loss in a way few others did, not just the sharp, immediate pain, but the long, lonely aftermath. Perhaps that was why he'd recognized something in her that day at the funeral, why he'd offered her a chance when she'd needed one most. And perhaps, she admitted to herself, as sleep finally claimed her, That was why she found herself drawn to him in a way she'd never expected to feel again. The next week passed without incident, their route taking them safely around the area where the rustlers had been spotted. The weather held fair, and the herd moved steadily northward. If they maintained their pace, Jacob estimated they would reach Helena in just over 2 weeks. Grace found herself counting the days with mixed emotions. She still hadn't decided whether to accept Jacob's offer to continue north to his ranch. The sensible choice would be to stay in Helena, to find respectable work and build a new life for herself. Yet every time she pictured saying goodbye to Jacob, something inside her rebelled at the thought. It wasn't just gratitude she felt for him, though there was plenty of that. Nor was it merely understanding or companionship, though both had grown between them during the weeks on the trail. It was something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster when he was near and ache with longing when he was distant. She was falling in love with him. The realization struck her one afternoon as she watched him calming a nervous colt that had become separated from its mother. The gentle strength in his hands, the quiet patience in his voice, they spoke of a man who cared deeply, however much he tried to hide it behind reserve. The knowledge both thrilled and terrified her. It was too soon, surely. Thomas had been gone less than 6 months. The baby, her beautiful, stillborn Elizabeth, had been buried barely more than a month ago. What kind of woman was she to be thinking of another man so soon? Yet she couldn't deny the feelings growing within her, any more than she could deny the gradual healing that had begun during these weeks on the trail. The pain of her losses hadn't disappeared, would never disappear entirely. But alongside it, tendrils of hope had taken root, nourished by hard work, open skies, and Jacob's steady presence. She was lost in these thoughts, kneading dough for the evening bread when a shot rang out in the distance. Then another and another. Grace froze, her flour-covered hands suspended above the dough as shouting erupted from the direction of the herd. Men ran past the wagon, grabbing rifles as they went. Young Liam paused just long enough to call, "Stay here, Mrs. Patterson," rustlers trying to cut off part of the herd. Grace's heart pounded as she watched the men form a defensive line, Jacob at the center directing them with calm authority despite the chaos. More shots were fired, some from their own side now. She caught glimpses of riders trying to separate a group of cattle from the main herd, driving them toward a ravine to the east. Without conscious thought, Grace reached for the small derringer she kept in her trunk, a gift from Thomas after they'd been robbed in their first week in Montana. She checked that it was loaded, then tucked it into her pocket before continuing to watch the unfolding battle. Jacob and his men were outnumbered but had the advantage of defensive position. She saw one of the rustlers fall from his horse, then another. The remaining thieves apparently decided the fight wasn't worth it. They wheeled their horses and galloped away, leaving their wounded or dead behind. The immediate danger past, Grace set aside the forgotten dough and hurried toward the men. Doc was already tending to someone on the ground with a jolt. She recognized the distinctive red kerchief Liam always wore around his neck. "Is he?" she began, fear clutching at her throat. "Just winged him," Doc said without looking up. "Bullet grazed his shoulder. He'll be sore but fine." Relief flooded through her as Liam managed a weak smile. "Told you to stay put, Mrs. Patterson. And miss seeing how brave you all were." "Not a chance," she replied, trying to keep her tone light despite her racing heart. She scanned the group, counting heads. One was missing. "Where's Jacob?" Doc jerked his chin toward the ravine. "Went after their leader, said he recognized him." Cold fear replaced the relief. Jacob was out there alone, pursuing armed men who had already shown they were willing to kill. Without stopping to consider the wisdom of her actions, Grace turned and ran toward the ravine. She heard Doc calling after her but ignored him. The only thought in her mind was reaching Jacob before something terrible happened. She crested a small rise and saw them in the distance, 2 men on horseback, facing each other about 50 yards apart. Even from this distance, she recognized Jacob's broad shoulders and the distinctive pattern of his horse. The other man was a stranger, thin and wiry with a shock of pale hair visible beneath his hat. They appeared to be talking, though she couldn't make out the words. Then, with horrifying suddenness, the stranger's hand dropped to his gun. Grace screamed Jacob's name as both men drew. Two shots cracked across the open plain, so close together they seemed like a single sound. Jacob swayed in the saddle but remained upright. The other man toppled slowly backward, falling from his horse to lie motionless on the ground. Grace ran the remaining distance, her lungs burning and her skirts hampering her steps. As she drew closer, she saw the dark stains spreading across Jacob's left side. "You're hurt," she gasped, reaching his side as he dismounted stiffly. "It's nothing," he said, though his face was pale beneath its tan. "What are you doing out here? You should have stayed in camp." "You're bleeding," Grace insisted, ignoring his question as she reached for the wound. Jacob winced as her fingers probed gently around the tear in his shirt. "Bullet just grazed me, like Liam." "This is more than a graze," she countered, alarmed by the amount of blood. "You need Doc." Jacob glanced at the dead rustler, his expression hardening. "He got what he came for. Did you know him?" Grace asked, remembering what Doc had said. Jacob's jaw tightened. His name was Fletcher. He was at Emily's town when it was raided, led the men who set the fires. His voice was flat. "I've been looking for him for 13 years. Grace felt a chill at the implication. "You knew he would be here. That's why you took this particular drive." "I had word he was operating in this region." Jacob met her gaze defiantly. "Does that change your opinion of me?" Grace considered the question seriously. "Did you take this job hoping to find him?" "Yes." "Did you put the herd or your men at unnecessary risk to do so?" Jacob shook his head firmly. "Never. The change of route was genuine. There really was a raid ahead of us. When I saw Fletcher among the rustlers today, it was unexpected." Grace nodded slowly. "Then no, it doesn't change my opinion of you. We all carry ghosts, Jacob. Some are just more tangible than others." Relief flashed across his face, quickly masked. "We should get back. The others will be worried." As they walked slowly back toward camp, Jacob's horse following obediently behind, Grace found herself wondering what this meant for them. Had confronting his past finally laid his ghosts to rest? Or had it simply reminded him of all he had lost by the time they reached camp? Jacob was leaning heavily on Grace, his face gray with pain despite his insistence that the wound was minor. Doc took one look and ordered him to lie down immediately so he could clean and stitch the injury. "Bullet's still in there," the old man declared after examination. "Going to hurt like hell coming out." Jacob nodded grimly. "Just do it." Grace stayed by his side as Doc prepared his instruments, heating them in the fire and laying out clean bandages. When Doc offered Jacob a bottle of whiskey, he shook his head. "Need a clear head," he said. "Just give me something to bite on." Doc handed him a folded leather strap. "Suit yourself." "Mrs. Patterson, you might want to step away for this part." "I'm staying," Grace said firmly, taking Jacob's hand in hers. "Unless you'd rather I go," she asked him directly. Jacob's eyes, clouded with pain, met hers. "Stay," he said simply. What followed was a brutal test of endurance. Doc worked efficiently, but removing a bullet without anesthesia was agonizing under the best circumstances. Jacob remained conscious throughout, his hand gripping Grace's with bone-crushing force, his jaw clenched around the leather strap. When it was finally over, he lay exhausted, his body slick with sweat, his breathing ragged. Doc bandaged the wound and administered a dose of laudanum that Jacob was now too weak to refuse. "He needs rest," Doc told Grace. "Fever's likely to set in by morning. Someone should stay with him." "I will," Grace said without hesitation. Doc nodded, unsurprised. "Call me if the fever gets too high or if the wound starts seeping more than a little. I'll check back in a few hours." Left alone with Jacob, Grace gently wiped his face with a cool cloth. The laudanum was taking effect, his features relaxed as the pain receded. "You should rest too," he murmured, his words slightly slurred. "I will," she assured him, though she had no intention of leaving his side. "Just close your eyes." Jacob drifted into an uneasy sleep. Grace watched over him through the night, sponging his brow when fever rose as Doc had predicted, changing the bandages when blood seeped through, holding his hand when pain broke through the haze of medication. In those quiet hours, as the camp slept around them and the stars wheeled overhead, Grace made her decision. She would go north with Jacob. Not as his housekeeper, not as his employee, but as whatever they might become to each other given time and healing. The thought no longer frightened her. Thomas would always hold a place in her heart, as would the daughter she never knew. But her heart, she was discovering, had room for new love alongside the old grief. Jacob had shown her that by example his love for Emily hadn't prevented him from opening himself, however cautiously, to new possibilities. Dawn was breaking when Jacob's eyes fluttered open, clearer than they had been through the long night. The fever had broken, leaving him weak but lucid. "You're still here," he observed, his voice hoarse. "I said I would be," Grace replied simply. He studied her face, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the worried crease between her brows. "You didn't sleep." "I'll sleep later. How do you feel?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule." He attempted to sit up and immediately regretted it, falling back with a groan. "Maybe 2 mules." Grace couldn't help but smile at his dry assessment. "Doc says you need to rest for at least 2 days. No riding," Jacob frowned. "We can't afford to lose time. The herd will survive 2 days of grazing in one spot. You, on the other hand, might not survive getting back on a horse too soon." Her tone brooked no argument. To her surprise, Jacob chuckled, then winced as the movement pulled at his wound. "Yes, madam, good. Now that we have that settled, are you hungry? I can bring you some broth." Jacob caught her hand as she started to rise. "Grace." His voice was serious now. "Thank you for staying, for—" He trailed off, seeming unsure how to express what he meant, "for not judging you about Fletcher." She suggested gently. He nodded. "That and everything else, you've been unexpected." Coming from Jacob, it was a profound admission. Grace squeezed his hand. "So have you." For 2 days, the drive halted while Jacob recovered enough to ride. Grace divided her time between her regular duties and caring for him, finding that the men were surprisingly capable of handling basic cooking tasks when necessary. By the 3rd day, Jacob insisted he was well enough to continue, though he conceded to riding in the wagon for part of each day rather than on horseback. Grace secretly suspected this concession was more for her peace of mind than his own comfort. As they resumed their journey north, the atmosphere among the group was lighter. The threat of rustlers seemed to have passed with Fletcher's death, and Helena was less than 2 weeks away. One evening, as they sat by the fire after the others had turned in, Jacob brought up the subject of their future directly. "Have you thought more about what you'll do in Helena?" he asked, his tone casual though his eyes watched her intently. Grace nodded. "I have, and—" He prompted when she didn't elaborate. She took a deep breath. "I'd like to continue north with you if the offer still stands." Relief and something warmer flickered across his face. "It stands. But not as your housekeeper," she added firmly. Jacob's brows drew together in confusion. "Then as what?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "As someone with the possibility of more. I don't know what's between us, Jacob. I only know that I'm not ready to say goodbye to it." He was silent for a long moment, and Grace feared she had misread the situation entirely. Then carefully he reached across the space between them to take her hand. "I didn't dare hope," he said quietly. "After Thomas, after the baby, I thought it was too soon." "It might be," she admitted. "I don't know what's right anymore. I only know that when I think of saying goodbye to you and Helena, it feels wrong." Jacob nodded slowly. "I feel the same. So we continue north together," Grace said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "But there's something you should know about the ranch." "What's that?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "It's a good place to raise children." The words pierced Grace like a physical pain, unexpected and acute. "Jacob, I don't know if I can, after Elizabeth." Understanding filled his eyes. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have presumed. No, she interrupted. It's all right, it's just, I'm afraid. Of what? He asked gently. Of trying again, of losing again. She swallowed hard. Of loving a child I might never get to hold. Jacob moved to sit beside her on the log, his arm going around her shoulders. I can't promise it won't happen, no one can, but I can promise you won't face it alone, whatever comes. Grace leaned into his strength, allowing herself to imagine a future she had thought forever close to her, a home, a family, love both old and new. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. One day at a time, she whispered. Jacob pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. One day at a time, he agreed. The remaining days of the journey passed in a blur of activity. As they drew closer to Helena, the landscape changed, becoming more populated. They began to encounter other travelers on the road, a sure sign they were approaching civilization. Jacob's wound healed well, though it continued to pain him after long days in the saddle. Grace noticed he was pushing himself too hard but knew better than to coddle him in front of the men. Instead, she made sure meals included strengthening foods and that he had fresh bandages daily. The night before they were due to reach Helena, the camp was alive with anticipation. The men were looking forward to proper beds, hot baths, and the various entertainments the growing city offered. Even Grace felt a flutter of excitement at the thought of real walls and a solid roof after weeks under canvas. After dinner, Jacob drew her aside. I need to speak with you, he said, his expression unreadable. Concern flickered through her. Is something wrong? No, just private. They walked a short distance from camp, stopping beneath a lone pine tree. The evening was mild, the western sky still tinged with the last orange glow of sunset. Jacob seemed uncharacteristically nervous, running a hand through his hair as he faced her. I've been thinking about what happens after tomorrow. Grace waited, unsure where this was leading. The men will be paid, the cattle delivered. I'll need to stay in Helena for a few days to settle accounts. He paused. It might raise eyebrows if you stayed with me during that time. Oh. Grace hadn't considered the propriety of their arrangement once they reached town. On the trail, necessity excused many things that would be frowned upon in civilization. I've been thinking, Jacob continued, that there's a way to avoid the gossip if you're willing. What way is that? Jacob took a deep breath. We could get married, tomorrow in Helena. Grace stared at him, certain she had misheard. Married? I know it's sudden, he said quickly. And I'm not doing this very well. I should have brought flowers or something. A laugh escaped her, born of surprise rather than amusement. Jacob Weston, are you proposing to me? He nodded, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him. I am, badly it seems. But why now, why so suddenly? Jacob took her hands in his. Because I love you, Grace. Because I don't want to waste another day pretending we're just trail boss and cook when we both know it's more than that. The simple declaration stole her breath. You love me, more than I thought possible, he admitted. After Emily, I never expected to feel this way again. But you. He smiled softly. You surprised me. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. I love you too, she whispered. But marriage, are you certain? I've never been more certain of anything, Jacob said firmly, but if you need time, I understand. We can wait until Grace silenced him by rising on tiptoe and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as Jacob's arms went around her, drawing her close against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Grace rested her forehead against his chest. Yes, she said simply. Yes, Jacob repeated, as if afraid to believe. Grace looked up at him, her heart full. Yes, I'll marry you tomorrow. The justice of the peace in Helena was accustomed to unusual couples, miners and dance hall girls, cowboys and schoolteachers, all manner of people thrown together by the unpredictable currents of frontier life. Still, he raised an eyebrow at the trail-worn pair who stood before him the next afternoon. You're certain about this? He asked, directing the question primarily to Grace. She nodded firmly. Very certain. They had arrived in Helena by mid-morning. While Jacob saw to the delivery of the cattle and paying the men, Grace had used some of her savings to purchase a simple blue dress to replace her trail-worn clothing. It wasn't a proper wedding gown, but it was clean and new, and Jacob's eyes had lit up when he'd first seen her in it. Doc and Liam stood as witnesses, the older man gruffly emotional and the younger beaming with excitement. The ceremony was brief and to the point, the justice reciting the familiar words without flourish. When it came time for the ring, Jacob produced a simple gold band that had been his mother's. As he slipped it onto Grace's finger, his hands were steady but his eyes betrayed his emotion. "I, Jacob, take thee, Grace, to be my wedded wife," he repeated after the justice, his deep voice unwavering. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When it was her turn, Grace's voice trembled slightly, but her conviction was absolute. "I, Grace, take thee, Jacob, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the justice declared. "You may kiss your bride." Jacob's kiss was gentle but thorough, leaving Grace flushed and breathless when they finally parted to the enthusiastic applause of Doc and Liam. Outside the justice's office, Doc pulled Jacob into a rough embrace while Liam shyly presented Grace with a small bouquet of wildflowers he had gathered that morning. "Congratulations, Mrs. Weston," he said, blushing furiously. "Mrs. Weston." The new name startled Grace momentarily. She had been Mrs. Patterson for such a short time, and now she was taking another name, beginning another life. Yet as she looked at Jacob, her husband, she felt no doubt, only a quiet certainty that this was right, that this was where she was meant to be. They spent 3 days in Helena, staying in a modest hotel while Jacob concluded his business. On the morning of the 4th day, they set out northward, traveling in the wagon that had been part of their journey from the beginning. Doc and the other men had gone their separate ways, but Liam had asked to come along, having no particular destination in mind. "Could use an extra hand at the ranch," Jacob had said, to the young man's obvious delight. The journey to Great Falls took another week, the terrain becoming more rugged as they traveled. Grace watched with growing anticipation as Jacob pointed out landmarks, his face lighting up as they drew closer to the place he called home. "Just over that ridge," he said late one afternoon, pointing to a distant line of hills. "We'll be there by sundown." Grace's stomach fluttered with nerves. What would this home be like? Would she belong there, or would she always feel like an intruder in the space Jacob had created for himself? As they crested the ridge, the ranch came into view in the valley below. A sturdy log house stood near a creek, smoke rising from its chimney. A large barn and several corrals were visible, as well as grazing cattle dotting the surrounding pastures. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. Jacob smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "Wait till you see it in the morning light or in winter with snow on the mountains." They made their way down the slope, and as they drew nearer, the front door of the house opened. A middle-aged woman emerged, shading her eyes against the setting sun. "That's Mrs. Hendricks," Jacob explained. "She comes from town to keep things in order when I'm away." The woman waved enthusiastically as they approached, her round face wreathed in smiles. "Mr. Weston." "We weren't expecting you for another week at least." "Made good time, Mrs. Hendricks," Jacob called back as they pulled up before the house. "I've brought company." The housekeeper's eyes widened as she took in Grace and Liam. "So I see, and who might these young folks be?" Jacob helped Grace down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her waist. "Mrs. Hendricks, I'd like you to meet my wife, Grace." The older woman's jaw dropped comically. "Your wife? Land's sakes, Mr. Weston, you go away on a cattle drive and come back married." "That's quite a feat, even for these parts." Grace couldn't help but laugh at the woman's frank astonishment. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hendricks. I hope I'm not putting you out of a job." Heavens, no, dear, this place is far too much for one woman to manage alone. I've been telling Mr. Weston for years he needs a proper mistress for the house. She beamed at them both. And who's this strapping young man? Liam O'Brien, madam, the young cowboy said, removing his hat. Mr. Weston's hired me to help with the ranch. Mrs. Hendricks nodded approvingly. Good, good. He's been needing help since old Pete's rheumatism got so bad. She turned back to Grace. Now, you must be exhausted from your journey. Come inside and I'll show you around your new home. As Jacob and Liam saw to the horses and wagon, Mrs. Hendricks led Grace through the house. It was larger than it had appeared from outside, a spacious main room with a stone fireplace, a well-appointed kitchen, and several bedrooms, including a large master chamber at the back of the house. Mr. Weston built most of this himself, Mrs. Hendricks said proudly. Started with just the main room and kitchen, then added on as he could. He's got plans for more, he told me once. Said someday he hoped to fill all those rooms. Grace ran her hand along a smooth pine beam, marveling at the craftsmanship. It's lovely. It needs a woman's touch, the housekeeper said frankly. Some curtains, maybe, and proper rugs, but it's solid and warm, and that counts for more out here. By the time Jacob and Liam came in, Mrs. Hendricks had prepared a simple but hearty supper. They ate at the large oak table in the main room, the conversation flowing easily as Jacob told the housekeeper about their journey and introduced Grace more fully. After the meal, Mrs. Hendricks insisted on handling the cleanup alone. You two need some time, she said with a knowing smile. I've made up the master bedroom fresh, and there's hot water for washing if you want it. When she had gone, taking Liam with her to show him to his quarters above the barn, Jacob turned to Grace with an almost shy expression. Well, he asked, what do you think of your new home? Grace looked around the warm, solid room, then back at the man who had built it, the man who had offered her not just shelter, but a future when she'd thought hers was over. I think, she said, moving into his arms, that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Later, in the privacy of their bedroom, Jacob held her close beneath the patchwork quilt. Outside, the Montana night was alive with the sounds of their new life together, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft rush of the creek, the occasional cry of a night bird. Happy. Jacob murmured against her hair. Grace nodded, her cheek against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. Yes, are you? More than I ever thought possible. His arms tightened around her. When I found you in Lavetta, I was just passing through. I never intended to stay, never planned to hire a cook I didn't need. Grace raised her head to look at him. What changed your mind? Jacob's eyes, soft in the dim light, met hers. You did. Standing there by that tiny grave, not broken but unbending. I recognized something in you that day, the same thing I'd felt after Emily. The need to keep moving forward, even when every step hurts. And now, she asked softly. Now, he said, brushing a kiss across her forehead, I think maybe we can stop running and start building instead. Grace settled back against him, content in a way she hadn't believed possible just months earlier. The wounds were still there, she still thought of Thomas sometimes, still ached for the daughter she'd never hold. Jacob still carried the memory of Emily and the long years of solitary grief that had followed. But alongside the old pain, new joy was taking root. Not replacing what they had lost, but growing beside it, making room for both remembrance and hope. As Grace drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, she whispered a silent thanks to whatever fate or providence had brought her to this place, to this man, to this second chance at happiness. The seasons turned, and life at the ranch settled into a rhythm that suited them all. Liam proved to be a natural with the cattle and a quick study under Jacob's tutelage. Mrs. Hendricks came 3 days a week from town to help with the heavier household tasks, though Grace gradually took over more of the daily running of the home. By winter, the house had indeed acquired more of a woman's touch: curtains at the windows, rugs on the pine floors, small touches that transformed Jacob's solid structure into a true home. They spent the cold months close to the hearth, Jacob teaching Grace to play chess, Grace reading aloud from books they ordered from back east. When spring came, bringing with it new calves and the first wildflowers, Jacob began building the addition he'd long planned: 2 more bedrooms and a small sitting room off the main house. "Planning ahead?" Grace asked one evening as they stood surveying his progress. Jacob smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Always good to have room to grow." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They had not discussed children since that night by the campfire, though the possibility hung between them, at once hopeful and terrifying. Grace had her monthly courses regularly, a reminder both of what she had lost and what might yet be. Each month brought a complex mixture of relief and disappointment that she kept to herself, uncertain how to voice her conflicting emotions. Summer arrived, hot and dry. Jacob and Liam spent long days on the range, while Grace tended the large garden she'd planted, putting up preserves for the winter and learning from Mrs. Hendricks the particular skills needed to manage a ranch household. In August, they hosted their first real gathering, a small affair to celebrate the completion of the addition. Neighbors from miles around came, bringing food and drink and staying late into the night. Grace found herself genuinely enjoying the company, laughing more freely than she had in months. As the last guests departed, Jacob found her on the porch, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "You were magnificent tonight," he said, handing her a cup of cool cider. "Everyone was singing your praises." Grace smiled, leaning against the porch rail. It felt good to have a house full of people, full of life. Jacob studied her in the soft lamplight spilling from the open door. "You've been different lately, happier, I think." "I am," she admitted. "I feel at home here with you." He nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying, that the worst of her grief had finally begun to recede, making room for other emotions. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment. "About," Jacob set his cup down and faced her directly. "About what you said last year by the campfire." "About being afraid to try again." Grace's heart quickened. "Yes, I've been afraid too," he confessed. "Afraid to hope for too much, afraid to want something that might be taken away." He took her hands in his. "But I've realized something these past months with you." "What's that?" she asked softly. "That some things are worth the risk, that loving someone or something doesn't guarantee you won't lose them, but it's the only thing that makes life worth living." His eyes were earnest in the dim light. "I want a family with you, Grace, if you're ready, if you want it too." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, not of sorrow but of something more complex: hope tinged with fear, desire shaded with memory. "What if," she began, her voice catching. "What if it happens again? What if I can't carry a child to term?" Jacob's hands tightened on hers. "Then we face it together. And we try again, or we find another way. There are always children needing homes." The simplicity of his answer, the certainty of his support, loosened something that had been tightly bound within her. "I want a family too," she whispered. "I'm still afraid, but I want to try." Jacob drew her into his arms, holding her close as the Montana night deepened around them. "Then we'll try," he murmured against her hair. "Together." Autumn came, painting the hills in gold and crimson. As the days grew shorter, Grace missed her monthly courses once, then again. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope, afraid to invite disappointment. But by the 3rd month, there was no denying the gentle swell of her abdomen or the persistent nausea that plagued her mornings. "Jacob," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, her sewing forgotten in her lap. "I think I'm with child." He looked up sharply from the accounts he'd been reviewing, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious joy. "Are you certain?" Grace nodded, one hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. "As certain as I can be. It's been 3 months since. And I've been feeling different." Jacob set aside his papers and moved to kneel before her chair, his hands covering hers. "How do you feel about it?" "Terrified," she admitted honestly. "Hopeful, grateful?" She met his gaze. "Mostly terrified." He nodded, understanding without needing more explanation. "We'll take every precaution. The doctor in town is supposed to be good, trained back east, and Mrs. Hendricks has delivered more babies than most midwives." "I know." Grace attempted a smile. I just can't help remembering. I know. Jacob pressed a kiss to her palm. But this is a new life, a new beginning, and whatever happens, we face it together. As winter settled over the ranch, Grace's body changed, her slender frame softening, her abdomen growing more pronounced. Jacob watched over her with careful attention, ensuring she rested often and ate well. Liam took on more responsibilities. Proud to be trusted with tasks Jacob would normally have handled himself. Mrs. Hendricks became a constant presence, moving into one of the new bedrooms just until the baby comes, she declared firmly. Her practical approach to pregnancy and childbirth was oddly reassuring to Grace, who had spent too many sleepless nights worrying about history repeating itself. Every baby is different, every birth is different, the older woman said matter-of-factly when Grace finally confessed her fears. What happened before was a tragedy, but it doesn't mean it will happen again. As the new year of 1880 dawned, Grace entered her 6th month. The baby's movements were strong now, visible through her clothing at times. Jacob would sit with his hand on her belly in the evenings, marveling at each kick and turn. Active little one, he remarked one night as a particularly energetic movement caused Grace to wince. Like his father, she replied with a smile. Always on the move. Jacob's eyebrows rose. You think it's a boy, Grace shrugged. Just a feeling, does it matter to you? Not in the least, he assured her. Boy or girl, this child will be loved. As winter gave way to spring, Grace's time drew near. The doctor visited from town, pronouncing both mother and child healthy and well-positioned. Mrs. Hendricks prepared the small room adjacent to the master bedroom as a nursery, setting up the cradle Jacob had built during the long winter evenings. It was different from the one Thomas had made larger, with gentle curves instead of straight lines, decorated with carved leaves and animals native to Montana. Grace had run her fingers over it the first time Jacob showed it to her, tears in her eyes at both the remembrance of what was lost and the promise of what might be. It's beautiful, she had whispered. I made it strong, Jacob had replied, his meaning clear. This cradle, like their love, was built to endure. On a warm May evening, as the sun was setting over the western hills, Grace's labor began. The pains started gently, mere tightenings that she had felt occasionally in recent weeks. But as darkness fell, they grew stronger, more insistent. It's time, she told Jacob calmly as he came in from checking on a new calf. Mrs. Hendricks has gone to fetch the doctor. Jacob's face paled slightly beneath his tan, but his voice was steady. What can I do? Just stay with me, Grace said, reaching for his hand as another contraction began. I don't want to be alone. And he did, through the long night that followed. When the doctor arrived, he raised an eyebrow at finding the husband in the birthing room but made no comment. Mrs. Hendricks efficiently prepared hot water and clean linens, her practical presence a comfort to them both. Unlike her first labor, this one progressed steadily, each pain bringing Grace closer to the moment of truth. As dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the bedroom in soft gold light, the doctor announced it was time to push. Jacob held her hand, supporting her shoulders as she worked with her body's demands. The pain was intense, but different from what she remembered, productive rather than futile, purposeful rather than endless. One more, the doctor encouraged. The head is almost here. Grace gathered her strength for a final effort, Jacob's voice in her ear murmuring words of love and encouragement. With a cry that was part pain and part triumph, she felt the baby slip from her body into the doctor's waiting hands. For one heart-stopping moment, there was silence. Then, the most beautiful sound Grace had ever heard, a strong, indignant wail as her child took its first breath. A boy, the doctor announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Grace's chest. And a fine one at that. Grace stared down at her son in wonder, the tiny face screwed up in protest, the perfect fingers curled into fists, the damp dark hair plastered to his head. Alive, breathing, real. Hello, she whispered, tears streaming unchecked down her face. Hello, my darling. Jacob's arm tightened around her shoulders and she looked up to see that he too was weeping without shame. "He's perfect," he said hoarsely. "Grace, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Samuel Thomas Weston, Samuel for Jacob's father, Thomas for Grace's first husband. It seemed right to honor the past even as they embraced the future. As Mrs. Hendricks helped clean and settle both mother and child, Jacob stepped onto the porch to greet the new day. The ranch was coming alive around him, cattle in the distance, birds calling from the trees, Liam already at work in the barn. Life, continuing as it always did with all its joys and sorrows, its endings and beginnings. When he returned to the bedroom, he found Grace propped up against the pillows, their son nestled securely in her arms. The sight of them together, his wife, his child, filled Jacob's heart with a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Come meet your son properly," Grace said, smiling up at him. Jacob sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with one gentle finger. Samuel turned toward the touch, his tiny mouth working in his sleep. "He knows his father," Grace said softly. Jacob shook his head in wonder. "I never thought. After Emily, I never imagined I could have this." "I know." Grace understood completely. "After losing Elizabeth, I was so afraid to hope." Jacob looked at her, his eyes full of the love they had built together. "You are the bravest person I know, Grace Weston." "No," she corrected gently. "Just someone who found a reason to keep going. Someone who held me when I cried for a baby I'd never hold, and showed me there could be life after loss." Jacob leaned forward to kiss her, a tender affirmation of all they had endured together and all that lay ahead. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "Both of you more than I can say." Grace smiled, her heart full to bursting with a happiness she had once thought lost forever. "We love you too." Outside, the Montana spring day unfolded in all its glory, sunlight on new grass, calves frisking in the pastures, wildflowers dotting the hillsides. Inside, a family that had been forged through grief and love and second chances welcomed its newest member, each holding tight to the precious gift they had been given, not an ending but a beginning. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something new and beautiful in its own right. A future, unfolding one day at a time with all its uncertainty and wonder. As Samuel slept peacefully in her arms, Grace thought of the long journey that had brought her here from Boston to Lavetta, from widow to wife, from grief to joy. The losses would always be part of her, just as Emily would always be part of Jacob. But those shadows no longer defined them. What defined them now was this home they had built together, this love they had found when neither was looking, this child who represented not just their future but their faith in it. "Thank you," Grace whispered, the words meant for Jacob, for Samuel, for whatever force had guided her to this moment. For the second chance she hadn't known to ask for, the healing she hadn't believed possible. Jacob's arm tightened around her shoulders, drawing her and their son closer. "No," he said simply. "Thank you." Outside their window, a new day continued to unfold, full of promise and possibility. Inside, a family embraced it together, step by step, moment by moment, love by love.